Could I answer those questions from Judy? Because she posed them to me right at the end.
Yes,
that's really helpful. But I was trying to emphasize, I don't see the two. I see the two things as entirely compatible. Yeah. But on the question of markets, yes, markets must be studied. But I want to resist them as the starting point. Yeah. And I think the Labour Constitution allows us to do that. You start with the Labour Constitution. So yes, markets are important. But if you start with the market, you then have to do exactly what you just did. So you start with the market and then you have to say, oh, but remember, it's not a natural thing. It's constituted. And you have to do so much explaining. So I think it's not a useful starting point. But yes, it's an object of study, certainly. And yes, the driving force, absolutely. So in Eric's Taxi Capitalism's paper, that's one of the things that you talk about with Uber is, this reminded you I don't think you referenced Schumpeter, but it reminded me of Schumpeter about how in looking to extract value, capital innovates, and often it innovates by borrowing money. So this is a big part of the picture as well, is the finance of these startups. So it borrows money, and then, as you say so well in that paper, the key innovation, or what's the word they use, disruption. The key disruption of Uber is to avoid the law, and that's classic Schumpeter as well. So the law is always a step behind. The law is always catching up. So yeah, you need that. You definitely need that dynamic. Capitalism is dynamic. That has to come through, and that's part of the political importance of the political economy framing as well.
The work contract does is it gets you into the micro analysis of what individuals want and in terms of their social norms.
Yes.
Then the labor constitution operates as the meso analysis, as the transmission. And then at the macro analysis, you're working within a more traditional Marxist framework, but supplementing it with a notion of socially embedded norms around status hierarchies at the bottom. Okay, got it, thanks.
Okay, fine. Now we have about 25 minutes, if I'm right. 25 minutes to discuss all those very interesting questions at the theoretical level, like relationship between economics and especially Marxism and economic sociology. Of law, the place of law in all the studies about platform economy, and also the empirical development that we are looking at currently. We will ask you to raise your hand, and we have a micro to be used just to record, for the recording of the interventions. So there is a first question. There is
Hi, I found all that very interesting. I think most of my questions relate to Eric's presentation, but what I was thinking was that within those frameworks, you need to actually probably integrate cross-subsidization, and particularly with respect to assets where people are using their own cars, for example. And the question of whether these systems of value extraction are sustainable, because the people who've accumulated sufficient capital to have their own car under previous employment conditions may not be able to do so in the future. So that's the whole notion of cross-subsidization, and cross-subsidization in the sense of women who are looking after children, doing a lot of unpaid work, chasing platform economy work, are effectively being subsidized by their partners who are in work that is able at this point maybe to subsidize them, or the state is helping, but that might not be sustainable. So I think those the self-contained approaches are not necessarily that helpful, because it seems to me we're missing the whole issue of sustainability and where it's leading to, and this can explain why personal services and consumers can be so low paid, because we have to look at what the alternatives are for those people and how they're being supported, whether it's through the state or through the family or through other forms of work. And I think the important thing of the ILO project was finding out how many people are doing platform work being subsidised by their current employers.
Yes.
Because they're doing it in their lunch hours or when they're not being supervised. And so actually it's all extraction. I think going back to the webs and all that is really important. And another point, which again sort of troubling me, is the whole issue of this transaction costs. Because the platform economy assumes is a way of transferring the transaction costs from the client to the individual. But nevertheless, the client is still engaged in transaction costs, because the whole theory of employment contracts is that, in some sense, because you have to keep changing it, you don't want to actually specify each task in detail, and now you're going back to that. And subcontracting to another employer is actually a way of avoiding those and allowing the other employer to take charge. Instead of that, you're doing it through the platform. It seems to me it may explain, in a way, the relatively low take-up. But it also leads to a sort of, this last point links to Ruth's thing about contracts, because when I was working on sort of inter-organisational contracting, what was important was that work contract was effectively determined between employers, because it was all predetermined before anybody got into the work contract. It was no longer the price and the intensity of work being determined by the employer and the employee, but by the inter-organisational contracting. And so I was wondering how you might fit that into your framework.
Just before the panel answer to the question, we have another question and two other questions.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you all. My questions are mainly to Eric, but one of them might speak to something that Ruth is trying to do. I really like these two models, the distinction between Model 1 and Model 2, and with respect to Model 2, I just wondered if you've thought about, because I know you've thought about this in other aspects of your work, what could be learned around from the regulation of supply chains for this model? Like, so much of this work is the platform work that I think you're imagining, and as people are talking about it, is service industry related. But I just wonder if there's some inspiration from effective regulation of supply chains. And the other question I had, I've been sort of dabbling into looking at irregular scheduling, which is a really hard thing to look at, I've discovered, and in the Canadian context. And I found it interesting that how you talked about the freedom to control one's schedule as driving, as I understood it, in particular Model 1 for the ground workers. And so there's, and I think this speaks to this question of the labor constitution. That's why you might have something to say about it. But it seems to me that on the one hand, there's a need to regulate scheduling through Employment Standards Acts and these sorts of things. And there's a lot of push in Ontario, and there's been regulation elsewhere. And at the same time, and I wonder if the regulation of scheduling through means such as the Employment Standards Act or better collective agreements, et cetera, could have a positive effect on ground workers' ability to control their working conditions in platform work, and or possibly in limiting platform work. And I just wonder if you've considered some of the interaction effect, because I know that, for example, Sheila Block did a study on the sharing economy where she found exactly the same thing, that the big driver was for people, especially women, to control their own schedules. But at the same time, I was in this panel yesterday with Jill, and Michelle O'Sullivan and colleagues talked about how the regulation of the 0-hour contracts in the Irish context had these perverse effects, and it sort of has led to, you plug one hole in a leaky boat and then other holes start to emerge. And I've been having these thoughts about scheduling myself, like wondering about what the right mix of scheduling regulation should be. And since you brought this up, it just struck me that, and since labor market, the argument that you're making around labor markets being constituted and constructed, and I just wonder if you've considered this, and if it might be an example of this co-constitution process that you're trying to describe.
Yeah, I was just, I suppose, building on some of the comments that Jill just made around issues around transaction costs and things. I mean, a neoclassical economist would tell you that the reason why markets are not imperfect is because of transaction costs and asymmetric information and things like that. So then there's this question about how we think about information and the web. And does this actually now provide everybody with perfect information and zero transactions cost? People can be, people are rated for their performance, and on average, that if you're a good driver, it should. You'll always get a nasty passenger who'll give you a bad rating and stuff. So, is this a situation where it's actually impossible to earn rents? If you think about information rather than land, Ricardo's initial theory of rent is that rent comes from the declining productivity of land as you bring more land into cultivation, etc., as you need more of it. Well, information is inexhaustible. So we either think that the early birds dominate the market and can gain a position of monopoly, or other people can always come in, and Lyft can provide competition to Uber and things like that. And so we, in terms of rent, we think about conventional Ricardian rents, non-conventional rents that come from hiring labour with particular characteristics, and entrepreneurial rents. That there are these kind of smarter ways of doing something. Somebody just had a brilliant idea, and kind of captured a market. So and then again, a lot of the work that we're talking about is how do we actually conceptualize value creation in these types of work. And I'd just like to make a plug for a book by a colleague of mine, Harry Pitts, who's been looking at new ways of looking at the theory of value. In relation to all these gig workers, freelancers, all these kinds of people, and how we think about that. So Harry Pitts is at Bristol. He's got a new book out called Critiquing Capitalism, and a shorter article as well in Economy and Society. But it seems to me that we need to kind of think about this because as you said, the neoclassical economists would say, "Oh, this is a world of perfect competition." Or we actually think that somebody somewhere is being exploited, and we can't yet work out whether it's the customer, the client, the worker, who's getting what out of these new relationships. Yeah. And we need to look at that theoretically as well as empirically to kind of work that out.
I agree.
We have a last question for this round from Isabelle Martin.
Thank you all for this great panel, and the questions are almost as good as the panelists. And I'm just so happy when anyone talks about power and economic sociology of law. It just makes my day. So I just want to throw in and one more thing about when I study power, I use like those old Marxist, new Marxist, Bowles and Gentis, their analysis of power, where to be in a position of power is to be on the short side of a relationship, like a short side of demand in front of many suppliers willing to contract but desperate to even. And I think that one of the power of, like, there's so much this plurality of models of getting work and also of switching from the local to the global, that just the power is increased by the choice of selecting which market. So every labor market is in competition, and every labor arrangement is in competition with the other. And it allows you to switch scales. And I think that we can bring in also this contract for work. You can switch the scale. You used to have, I'm not saying it was perfect, of course it's not, but you have a personal scale of the cleaning person who comes to your home, and you switch it to a transaction scale. And then you can put Ian McNeill and all his analysis of relational contracting and transaction contracting. And it's always this power to determine the terms of the relationship.
So I'm asking the panel to answers to those questions, beginning with Eric.
I'm not sure if I have answers. I've learned, as you say, from the questions, they're enormously helpful. First of all, in terms of transaction costs, not so much in this paper, in the Uber paper, I did engage with a discussion about this transformation from employment to contracting, which is so much a part of this gig economy more broadly, and also platform-mediated work. Indeed, I drew on some of your earlier work around how platforms and this technology indeed shift transactions costs so that employment now actually might look like it is, has, and supervision costs and all of that are actually a less efficient way of organizing than through independent contracting and the ability of algorithms and sort of these computer-generated searches that take care of all of what otherwise might have been involved, right? So that does, I think, certainly partly explain the larger shift that we've seen and how platforms in particular are good at reducing transaction costs. So, and I'm looking forward to reading more, because I've been sort of looking around to sort of find more people who are writing about these topics, and I know there's a lot more that I need to examine in that regard. Yeah, just in terms of Leah and, I can't talk about all of it. So Leah and the supply chain strategies, I mean, much of that is, so in the paper, in looking at the consumer worker, ground worker relationship, although I guess it could be, consumers and cloud workers too, I mean, in supply chains, but it does, since the consumer is not the business that is trying to extract value from the labor of the worker, it does, I think, leave open a space for there to be some kind of an alliance, right, between consumers and workers. And so we've seen attempts, right, in this to mobilize consumer boycotts, right, of unfair products that are produced in an unfair manner. Theoretically, we could see that in platform-mediated work, but so far, I haven't, in the literature that I've read, I didn't see examples of Uber riders being mobilized, right, to boycott Uber because of the poor labor conditions or of, other consumers. Now maybe there was a movement, I think you mentioned, in Fedora. So maybe there is some, there are places where that can happen, but it's likely to happen on a local level, I think. And, so there's possibilities, but I suspect they're limited. I don't know if there are other drivers that could be used to sustain and develop supply chain regulation in platform-mediated work. There were, I think in Germany, some attempts to try to pressure platforms to sign codes of conduct in the cloud work kind of arrangements. But from the article, or at least what I read of that, the platforms were reluctant to do it because of concerns that unless it's universalized, they're going to lose their clients. And that is why one of the reasons why I saw the power in that triangle as being in the business client rather than principally with the platform operator. And if the platform operator doesn't have the power, there's limited gains, I think, that could be made by sort of trying to target them as the source of, as a point where you can get some kind of regulation imposed. So I think I should probably just stop there.
I will shift to Ruth.
Thank you. Like Eric, I mainly say thank you for the questions and comments. They're really helpful. So all I have is a couple of scattered thoughts rather than answers. To Jill, yeah, that's very helpful. Two things come to mind. First of all, the question of how widely we throw the net when we talk about the contract for work and which contracts do we include. I mean, certainly this is not limited to contract for employment, clearly, but what about franchising contracts and things? So that's something that we still need to think about. But the notion that the terms of a contract for work are being determined by two different employers is an interesting one. We do want to look within the project at the role of human resource managers, particularly focusing on them also as employees themselves, and where are the pressures upon them in terms of, and also where do their understandings of the law come from and the objectives of what they, so that's one of the things we'll be thinking about. Is it Peter at the back? Or perfect information isn't one of the important things for a company like Uber, the fact that they hold a lot of the information themselves and don't share it with either the customer or the worker. I remember reading just the other day that, for example, Uber can be aware when a customer's phone battery is running low and they charge a higher price in situations like that. So yeah, they have information which the customer, that doesn't answer your question, but that's a thought that occurs. As to value extraction, as Eric emphasizes in his paper, clearly this is something we need to think about, but one of the answers to the questions of where is Uber extracting value at the moment is they're not, because they're not profit making, and their money comes from credit. So yeah, that's all I have to say, I think.
Okay, Vera?
No.
No?
Jet lag.
And Judy, you have...
Well, that is
further
really one
remarks.
of the interesting things, because Uber isn't making profit, but it's got a massive, shareholding that's coming up, like absolutely 3 times as big as the biggest. So I think then linking this into financialization is probably a really significant way of dealing with this and seeing how these kinds of I think there's rents being taken, right? Because we know that the markets aren't transparent. We know that they're asymmetric. We know that there's a whole range of proprietary battles going on in courts right now in the United States as Google employees shift to Uber and shift out of Uber. So I think linking it back to kind of how finance capital is dealing with this, because someone's making a lot of money on these public offerings, and that's a huge source of value that's being extracted. So one of the things that I'm pleased to see in the literature is a renewed focus on theories of value and how those operate. So that's really useful help, I think. But it also does show us where points of resistance can be made, right? I think that's really critical, because if it isn't the platform that's extracting the value and it is the client, going after the platform just shuts them down. But it doesn't mean that something else isn't going to pop up. It's not a sustainable solution in the long run. So that's why we need a better notion of not just how the markets are constructed, but where value is being extracted through the market. But really helpful comments.
Okay, so, well, I think we can, there is a last question.
Judy actually just said exactly what I was going to say, so I'll just elaborate on that briefly, which is that I think that we're missing something if we're not considering rent-seeking behavior in a broader sense and the relationship between different forms of rent-seeking. And I think one of the things we have to be a little bit careful of is bracketing off platform work from platform economies. Because if we think, for example, if we bracket off Airbnb, right, from Uber, we're not considering the ways in which Airbnb are reshaping labor markets in particular kinds of ways, not necessarily through a direct employment relationship, right? So they are creating potentially new forms of labor or new employment relations that have to do with actually other forms of rent-seeking behavior and value generation, including land rents in a traditional sense. The other thing I would say, just to follow on from Judy's point, is that value generation in the tech sector it's not revenue dependent. It's not dependent on revenue streams. And so transaction costs actually matter less. And so we've got forms of entrepreneurial rent seeking that occur in the financial sector whereby value kind of appears simply by access to information and particular social milieus. And so I guess what I'm advocating for is, I think all of these approaches and typologies are really useful. But to go back to Ruth's point, one of the things I find really interesting is that in my discipline, we start from the opposite perspective, which is that labor markets are always socially constructed, and that contracting is a technical process. So you would have to qualify the notion of the contract as not being an economistic relationship, whereas markets are always understood as inherently social. So I think connective analyses that are able to make these kind of multi-level forms of interventions are going to be really important for being able to connect up these different dimensions.
Are there other questions? So we will finish here our great workshop. Just before you leave, well, first I think we should warmly